let me just. I already like the thing about Harris is that, you know, I genuinely don't like. I would be being totally dishonest. I think anybody in this space. I don't know what the right word is. I mean, I think fans is actually a really weird word, and it does not describe the kind of relationships that people have in today's media environment. If you're doing more sort of like direct to audience, one-to-one kind of media, like I have, a huge amount of respect for my audience, and especially the ones like I engage with, I learn a tremendous amount from. But that being said, like, for everything from like your sort of personal psychological desires to the need, at least in some people's cases, probably not in Sam's case, because I do think he's a trust fund baby, to make a living, you want a motivated, faithful, engaged audience that really cares about your work and will talk about it and promote it, on different platforms and in community. I really genuinely don't think I would ever want the sort of cult-like devotion that certain people cultivate, intentionally or unintentionally. So, Sam has a contingent of people that absolutely treat him like a guru. They can't abide any criticism of him. They can't even abide, forget, someone like me or Sam who really criticize Sam Harris. They can't even deal with maybe I just don't want him on my podcast. Don't find his work particularly engaging. I mean, there is a sort of level of religiosity and fanaticism, which is quite bizarre. There's another contingent of people that I think, this is where style comes in. I find the guy just sort of dreadfully boring, and the things that he explores, like, I'd prefer to listen to a Joseph Goldstein Dharma talk or read Stephen Batchelor on, secular Buddhism, or these other areas that he explores, I don't find particularly compelling to go through him for. But, I get that some people do. So all that being said, and I guess that's just a way of stipulating that I know that there's always going to be a contingent of people that are always just going to relate to him in a cultish way. But I think the reason that this Ezra Klein exchange has caused Sam such a meltdown is for the following reasons. Number one, the subject of IQ and intelligence and genetics is a deeply complicated one that is highly politicized, and almost any time you hear somebody using those stats to make assertions about hereditary intelligence, they're doing it because at the very least they have a subtext political agenda. In Charles Murray's case, it's actually quite clear, and this goes even beyond whether we deem him a racist or not, which I certainly think, and you could listen to work I've done with Nathan Robinson after a real analysis of his work, you absolutely can deem him that. But the subtext of all of Charles Murray's work, and the reason that recently he's moved as he started to write Coming Apart and focus on the quote unquote, the white working class, because essentially as economic inequality has spread, some of the people, the numbers on things like divorce and things that people used to racially pathologize as part of a right-wing strategy against social intervention are getting more evenly distributed. So the subtext of Charles Murray's work, which is that because so much of intelligence is genetic and because you can't do anything from a policy perspective, therefore we should have a absolutely stripped down narrow safety net, which is actually the bread and butter of his work. See, his work is, in my view, bigoted. It is incredibly one-dimensional in its reading of science and incredibly uncharitable and unengaged historically. But the actual purpose of what he's trying to do is create justifications that are grounded in social sciences to justify not doing anything in terms of public policy. That's why he's funded. That's why he's at a American Enterprise Institute. I think he's still there. So that's his subtext. And this conversation of, the only other thing I'll say about race and intelligence is that the notion, first of all, nobody has accounted for things like the Flynn effect, which show broadening intelligence rising across the board. Two, we can say that, of course, things like IQ tests are culturally dependent and contextual, because what is rewarded and what is necessary intellectually absolutely varies from society to society. How would Sam Harris or somebody like that thrive in a society where sort of like empathy and social bonding was key? Or how would any of us survive in a society that was a hunter-gatherer context? Intelligence literally varies from context to context. So and also, number three, the notion that we could say after hundreds of years of everything from slavery to apartheid to mass murder to terrorism to everything from policy discrimination to pop culture stereotypes to the diligent work of so-called public intellectuals to reaffirm that people of color or black or Hispanic people are dumber than white people, that the countervailing evidence that social policy can't work to overcome those gaps because a couple of decades of discrimination no longer being legally acceptable and a couple of school enrichment programs proves the case of environmental conditions not having significant impact is delusional. And if we look at things like the epigenetics research coming out, that literally things like the stress and traumas of oppression being spread intergenerationally, and everything from class to race to all these other biases informing and shaping us, it's a delusional claim. And if anything, we could read that same data, and it could be an argument for even more radical and robust intervention. So all that being said, Sam Harris waded into a debate because he saw some students at Middlebury shout down Charles Murray. Now, I think Charles Murray should be confronted and embarrassed and challenged wherever he goes. His work actually has, in fact, been debunked by serious scientists. It does have bizarre racial motivations, and underlying it is an extremist libertarian ideology. Harris sees this, and because Sam Harris's whole gig is actually just, at this point, a more intellectually refined version of whatever triggers the libtards must be true, has Charles Murray on his show, doesn't get into any depth on any of the policy questions that were just raised, doesn't have any, of course, as with everything else, is robustly ahistorical and has no situational awareness as where we are today. He raises some things like the Flynn effect, but basically doesn't challenge Murray on anything. Then there's a piece in Vox that robustly criticizes Murray and his work, and Harris does his usual thing, which has a meltdown. And it's unfair, and it's out of context, and it isn't right, and blah, 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 which is always his move. Now, in reality, Sam Harris jumped to his usual hoop, which is that the greatest threat in the world today is college students or an intolerant left, that whole meme, and jumped on board with Charles Murray, who is at the very least controversial and highly disputed in this field, who has a policy agenda that Harris doesn't even get into. Then there's pushback, and then Harris does his usual sullen sulk out of context thing, which led us to the Ezra Klein blow up of basically Harris and Klein going back and forth over email, and it's starting with Ezra Klein being like, well, I would go on your podcast, but I think it'd be better if you had someone like Nisbet, who's one of the authors in the piece on Vox, who actually challenged you and Murray. Harris, is like, Nisbet is not mainstream. Nisbet is actually quite mainstream, teaches at University of Michigan, and is very respected in the field, and is in fact, at credentialed universities. Charles Murray's at a think tank. Also bearing in mind, while Sam Harris is doing this whole victim complex thing about Charles Murray because of the thing at Middlebury, which I agree wasn't the right strategic approach to Murray at all, but Charles Murray has never been silenced. Charles Murray's, one of his recent books was reviewed in the New York Times twice. He is quoted on, article and journal pieces all over the place. He's been on everything from mainstream news programs to Bill Maher.
It's more accurate to say he's heavily subsidized.
He is a heavily subsidized public intellect since at least the 70s, whose writings and theorizings on everything are readily available to anyone. So that frame is, again, just utterly delusional. And, and Sam doesn't have any sense of the policy or the funding or any of those other areas that he doesn't have any discipline or interest in thinking about. So Ezra Klein and he have this whole exchange, which always just, again, returns again and again and again to Klein raising points, whether they be controversies inside the field, which Harris is ignoring and discounting, or broader political and ethical concerns, which, don't fit inside Harris's narrow, rigid worldview, which he discounts. And then it all culminated in Klein writing actually a very thoughtful piece, which also gets into Stamped from the Beginning, which is a brilliant book on the construction of racism in our history, and this sort of attempt to naturalize it. And the point that, of course, in fact, that two affluent white guys sitting around speculating about, black people being dumb is really, it's like saying that two people fucking in porn is novel. This is one of the most, common activities in American history, and something that has so much destructiveness on so many different levels, to the point even where, I remember in an earlier exchange between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Andrew Sullivan about this, where Andrew Sullivan, who also should be held accountable for spreading this stuff, was going back again and again and again to, this sort of nerdist need to speculate. And Ta-Nehisi Coates was like, well, I don't find the contemplation of my basic humanity and intellectual capacity to be particularly interesting. But but Ta-Nehisi made the point that, I'm somebody who grew up in a, black working class intellectual context, and then I went to Howard. So I was insulated from this broader cultural sense of diminishing black intellect and achievement because of my cultural context. But there's a lot of people out there that, from everything from the cultural racism and stories we tell to the policy to the continuing, realities of policing and so on and so forth, and tracking in schools and implicit bias in teaching and all of these things, they don't have necessarily the same, inclination. And I almost see the way people wield some of these statistics, which, by the way, these statistics are not what's in debate. That's not the issue. The issue is this much broader contextual conversation around them, which actually is what is relevant, to the extent any of these numbers are relevant to measure to begin with. By the way, brief tangent. I mean, Harris particularly keeps harping on, Murray at least has a policy agenda here. I want to prove and naturalize these things so we don't do anything about them in terms of redistribution and addressing injustice. That's why he does what he does. Harris is on this whole treat everybody like an individual, and the only way to do it is be an individual, in which case, great. Then you should have zero interest in any distributional differences in any metric. You should only be interested in individual IQ, period. Individual this, individual that. If that you're going to make a fetish of your ideology, you shouldn't even be interested in these conversations. That being said, I think that this kind of putting this stuff out there is actually a sort of, this could play into epigenetic trauma in and of itself. And that's science. That's not posturing. So Sam released the emails, and Ezra wrote a good piece, and Sam looked like a pestilent child having a controlled emotional breakdown, which is what he is. Because actually, really, what is revealed in this stuff is just a pathological inability to absorb any criticism that is not tightly defined in his terms. And now he received such a backlash. And I think it's also important from a brand position because, Ezra Klein, look, if somebody like a Glenn Greenwald, who I totally respect, I have disagreements with, but Glenn's great. But, Glenn's a serious intellect, but Glenn's a polemicist. Glenn's on the left. Glenn doesn't pretend to value the things that Harris fetishizes in a disingenuous way. But Ezra Klein is that. Ezra Klein is civil Spock. And he exemplified all of the virtues that these people constantly go on about. Civil, respectful, open exchange of ideas, intellectually broad, data-focused, up-to-date with all of the latest research in all relevant fields. And Sam Harris had a tantrum and released private emails without permission, which is, by the way, I think the second time he's done this, beginning with the Chomsky thing. It's a very, and if you go back and listen to the thing, Omar Aziz, who wrote a critique of Harris a couple years ago, and Harris's conditions of him coming on the podcast were that they would read his essay together line by line and go over it. You can see this pattern of very bizarre, weird, unhinged, controlling behavior on Harris's part, reflecting this cult-like attitude in some of his followers. And he got a backlash. He was embarrassed. So he wrote, judging, and this is what his addendum to his email dump, judging from the response to this post on social media, my decision to publish these emails appears to have backfired. I was relying on leaders to follow the plot and notice Ezra's evasiveness and gaslighting. Whatever, read it for yourself. E.g., his denial of misrepresentation of slurs in the very article he published. Many people seem to have judged from his politeness that Ezra was the one behaving honestly and ethically. This is frustrating, to say the least. And he goes on and on. I mean, look, what can you say? I mean, Sam Harris is incredibly popular. Some serious people share platforms with him. Certainly serious people, I think, more in the policy-making world don't. And I would just say, if you're somebody, I think that there's some people who follow a through line, and the one note pared down nonsense about Islam and foreign policy flows perfectly with embracing Charles Murray and a pseudo-scientific quest to confirm the biases of a affluent white elite, which is essentially what this is. But if you're somebody who is gung-ho about the Islam stuff but concerned about the racism stuff, you have to see, and I'm not saying I understand there are some distinctions between a group of people as an ethnicity and a religious belief, although it's certainly not as neat as people trying to make that conversation. But if you can't see the through line of policy illiterate, aggressively ahistorical abstractions, which always lead to a one-dimensional rendering of a otherized group, if you don't see a pattern there, then you're simply not being serious or rigorous. And this is why history matters. This is why context matters. Not to be PC, not to blah, 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 not all these other fucking talking points. We can criticize anything. We can talk about any data. But if you don't have a context for understanding it, and your mission, by the way, isn't justice and liberation, but reinforcement of lazy beliefs, status quo, and empathy-free soft bigotry, this is where you end up. And, I don't ever call for people to be deplatformed or anything. But look, and I've said that, I even said that about Mike Cernovich. But as I said with him before, and I say with Sam Harris now, you should know exactly who it is you're listening to, reading, and talking about. And this is somebody who I don't even think he recognizes it himself, but he absolutely is of and belongs to a soft alt-right. No question about it. Okay.